Hey everybody, Chad from Patriot Astro. Welcome back. Today is the second exoplanetary processing video, and today we're going to cover HOPS. Now, HOPS is probably my favorite of the three software packages to work with because it's the easiest and the quickest from start to finish. It also has a good amount of flexibility. However, you'll see that it is pretty limited in what the output provides. You don't have as much flexibility as you do, say, with AIJ. For those of you that don't feel like fighting a whole lot, this may be the tool for you. Remember, like, subscribe, and share this video with others, and turn on notifications so you know when this and other videos show up down the road. All right, so let's not waste any time today. Let's jump right in. Let's use HOPS. And if you have any questions, reach out any way possible, and I'll always be glad to help. Before we can begin, we're going to go get the software, and we're going to get that from ExoWorlds Spies. Once you get to their website, go to the software section and you should be able to see the download. Scrolling down, you can see the prerequisites as well as some basic Python download and install instructions. Scrolling back up to the top, we can click the download HOPS 3.0.4 link, and that should download as a zip file to your downloads folder. I'll just show you here quickly that I'm actually running Python 3.9.5. Once you have Python installed, just unzip the HOPS folder somewhere on your machine. Then open that folder, and there are multiple installer commands present. Double-click the installer for your operating system. At the end of the install process, it'll provide you a link. Here in Windows, I have a hops.cmd installed on my desktop automatically. There's also a PDF manual available here, and while it's not perfect, it can be a little bit helpful. I'll just double-check the files I'd like to process before moving forward. Here you can see I have my light frames as well as my bias darks and flats. We're going to talk more about that in a minute as far as how HOPS likes to have that data structured. So I'll just go ahead and double click the hops.cmd and it will leverage Python to start up and provide me the user interface. Once HOPS opens, you'll see at the top that there's an updates and user manual. Clicking that will just bring you back to the original download page where you can see if there's a newer version of the software and get to the latest PDF file. Below that is my profile. While not required, it can make things a little bit easier moving forward if you populate some of this data. Now, the next thing that I find helpful about HOPS is that it provides you step-by-step ordered instructions to follow. The first step is to select your data and target. Basically, this is telling it where your data resides on disk and also making sure it's aware of what target you are looking at. The next step is to run reduction. This is where your calibration frames will be combined into master files and then processed against your light frames. After that, we go to inspect frames. This is where we're going to look at the post-calibrated data that's provided to us to determine if any of the frames needs to be taken out of the data set. Once we've cleaned up our frames, we can move on to running alignment. After alignment, we'll move on to photometry. This is where we will select our target and any comparison stars. We'll set our aperture sizes, and then we'll go ahead and extract that data and look at the models. And then the last step will be ExoPlanet Fitting. This is where we'll determine which set of photometry we want to use based on the output light curves, and then we'll complete our final fitting. So let's go ahead and get started with select data and target. Now, if you watch my Astro Image J video as well, I'm using the same data set here. First thing we need to do is choose the directory. Now, HOPS requires all of your images to be in the same folder. I'm not going to start that way, so I'm just going to select the light folder where my light frames reside. Now, notice it doesn't detect any files. So I can show files and see that I have specific file names in my light frames folder, and I can set the identifier here for matching. I'll just type HAT. Notice it found 100 files as a result. Now, below this, I don't see any matches for bias, flats, or darks. That's because the bias, flats, and darks need to be in the light folder along with those files. In order for that to happen, I'm going to go back to my file system and I'm going to move all of those calibration files into my light frames folder. Now, because I'm putting all my bias, lights, and darks in the same place as my light frames files, I cannot have the target identifier in the name of the bias, darks, and flats files. If they did have that same identifier, they would be flagged as light frames, which would be incorrect. So you might want to do a little bit of pre-planning if you're going to use HOPS. Make sure your light frames have a specific target identifier in them and that your bias, darks, and flats don't have that identifier but do separate themselves with keywords of bias, dark, and flat. Now when you get everything in one place, I actually need to refresh this information for it to be detected, so I'll go back and tell it to choose the directory again. Once I've done that and fixed my target identifier, you can see all of my files have been found. 100 light frames, 15 bias, 5 dark, and 15 flat. Now that we've identified all those files, the next option it provides us is whether we would like to bin or subframe our files after the calibration completes. As a general rule, don't do this. Moving down the form, it now wants to make sure that certain fits header keywords exist in our light frame files, specifically the exposure time and the observation date. To verify this, click Show Header. We can see our exposure time and our observation date keywords match and the data is present. Next, the system needs to know about your timestamp. Is your timestamp relative to the start of the exposure, the middle of the exposure, or the end of the exposure? Here I'm using NINA, so it will be the start of my exposure. After that, we need to choose a target. You're presented with 3 options. The top option is there if your fits header has RA and DEC coordinates in it because the files are solved. The second option is there if you have an internet connection. The system can use Simbad over the internet based on a keyword search. And the bottom option is always available if you just want to force specific coordinates. So let me go ahead and do a name search. If I start to type the name, you can see it's identified, it located a match, which is great. It means it'll pull in all the additional data to go along with that. Below this, you can see some additional keyword information. This is being pulled from my profile. If you don't have data here, you can type it in manually. However, the final option that is absolutely required is the filter information. Now, I used a luminescence filter, so I'm just going to select that here. So now we have a couple final options on this page here. The first one is to not save anything and return to the main menu. The second option is to save what we have here and return to the main menu. And then the third option is to save everything and proceed to the next step. I certainly find the third option to be the easiest. So it'll automatically now proceed to running reduction. You can see it's actually building our master bias, dark, and flat, and then it will take those calibration files and process all of our light frames using them. I've sped this up. This will take a little bit of time. Now it'll automatically move on to the next section, which is Inspect Frames. Here we're allowed to look at the frames after calibration and decide if we'd like to remove any of them from further processing. There are 2 charts in the upper right-hand corner. The first one is relative to the sky and the sky brightness. The one below that is relative to the half width, half max of the average stars in the image. Now they're hard to see because they're pretty thin, but there are actually in both of those charts 2 small arrows pointing up to a specific dot in both the top and bottom charts. This is the frame we're currently viewing on the left. Now I can adjust the view of the frame on the left numerous ways, including changing the stretch values, as well as toggling it to an inverse image using white sky. I can mirror the image and I can even flip the image. Back on the right side, we'll notice that our sky chart is U-shaped. That's normal, especially as we're targeting something across multiple altitudes and through a meridian. This is typically related to air mass. Now using these 2 charts, if I'd like to look at a specific frame, I can just simply left double click a dot to show that image on screen. Notice the arrows will now be pointing at that dot. I can also remove a dot from further processing and turn it red by right double clicking that particular dot, which will mean that frame will not be processed. Now you don't have to go through every single frame, but do pay extra attention to the first frame in the stack. This one is critical. All of your alignment that's going to happen in the next major step within HOPS is based on the stars found in the first frame. Now there are a couple other ways you can go through and get rid of multiple dots at the same time rather than clicking on each one individually. And these are these options down here on the bottom right. So the first one for sky threshold, I can set a number here which will draw a horizontal line across the top chart, and anything above that point will be excluded, meaning anything with too bright of a sky could be excluded. Now this is not always necessary, especially if you're imaging entirely through astro dark. You're still going to see an air mass effect on your target, but it doesn't mean that the sky was ever too bright. To remove the line, just type 0 back in the field. You can also do the same thing here at the bottom chart using PSF threshold. Again, this is not always necessary. There'd typically be some bigger outliers required for me to use this capability. Once we've got everything the way we want it to be, we can simply save the options and proceed to the next step, which is running alignment. Remember, that first frame is critical. If during this process you ever get an error and it prompts you for a yes/no response, it's typically telling you it had a problem with its basic alignment attempt. If the frame is not bad, but just maybe a little bit shifted or flipped, just say no, do not discard, and the system will try a little bit harder to perform an alignment with a wider range of tolerance. If it is a bad frame, say yes to exclude the frame. Once alignment completes, we'll move on to photometry. First thing you need to do is locate your target star. Now I know where my target star is, but there are a couple options here. One, if you use NINA's ExoPlanet Plugin, you can use the output from there to help identify the target star. We could also use things like Simbad here to go directly to Simbad from the HOPS tool. We could also use something like Swarthmore's Transit Finder to find our transit and click on the annotated image. The bottom line is make sure you find the appropriate transit star. When you've got it, double-click that star. Immediately after double-clicking the star, you'll notice that boxes will be put up around other stars in your field of view. This is HOPS attempting to find comparison stars for you. Now it's doing that purely based on the brightness of the stars in the field of view as compared to the brightness of your identified target star. By default, it's going to identify stars that are within 40% of your target star's light level. That's adjustable up here in the top right-hand corner, and you can move that number up and down. Now remember, not all stars of the same light level in a single frame are good comparisons, but it is an easy way to make at least an attempt at finding comparisons. Ideally, you'd also like to rule out things like other variable stars. You'd also like your comparisons to be the same stellar type and color if possible. For this example, we're just going to use what HOPS provides us, and we'll see where that takes us. Now after selecting that target star, some data did come up here, so we can see its location, as well as the counts and HWHM, as well as an initial guess at an appropriate aperture radius, which is a circle we want to place around the star for measuring the light level of that star. Now that guess, or that number, is based on 1.4 times the FWHM of the average star in your image. So if I zoom in here, we can see that that aperture sits on our star. If we'd like to try to get a different view of the star based on the stretch, we can manipulate some of the sliders in the bottom left-hand corner to maybe give us a slightly different stretch view. Now a well-defined aperture makes a big difference, so I'm going to go ahead and grow this a little bit because it looks like I have some light leak. I'm going to move this up to 18.5 to include a little bit more light from the edge of the star. Now once we've got our target ready, we can move on to our first comparison star. Make sure you click the radio button in front of comparison 1. Then go look for a valid comparison star. As you're mousing around the image, notice down here below the image we can see the counts. We're going to look for something that hopefully is pretty close to the number of max counts for our target star. Now that we've double-clicked this as a comparison, the aperture line shows up as well as all of the data points for that star. Now we have to determine if the aperture is valid for this star. When adjusting the apertures, you also have some options at the bottom of the screen that may be able to help you, especially with poorly shaped stars. Things like aligning the aperture to the geometric center instead of the PSF peak of the star, or allowing the system to vary the aperture size in proportion to the PSF changes. So let's go ahead and change this aperture. I'm going to make it a little bit smaller, so I'll take it down to about 13.5. And just so you know, just because you've set an aperture doesn't mean you can't go back and readjust it. So now let's repeat this process and find some more comparison stars. Minimally, we want 2 comparisons. The maximum HOPS will give you is up to 10. Here you can see I've chosen 5 comparison stars. When we're ready, we can click Run Photometry. Now photometry will proceed, and what the system's going to do is look at every one of these stars in every image in our stack. The target line at the top is plotting the target's light divided by the average of all of the comparisons we selected in that same frame. Each comparison's line of data is plotting its own light to the average of all of the other comparisons. Now this will take a little bit of time, and I've obviously sped it up here. Notice once this process completes, you'll get a pop-up on the screen telling you that it's saved the results of this to a specific folder, in this case, Photometry. If I go look at this on disk, I can see what it's placed in the photometry folder. Now, before proceeding away from this, we want to inspect our photometry data. Now, the first thing I'm looking at and that I notice is that comparison 5 is behaving unlike any of the others, especially as we get between the 3rd and 4th hour of observation. And it's more noticeable when I highlight some of the other stars in that same space. You can see we're going downward on C5, but upward in C1 and C3. We can easily remove one of the comparison stars by simply unchecking it. Notice when you uncheck a comparison, it will impact all of the other comparisons and the target data. For this reason, selecting appropriate comparisons is critical. Now, there may be other comparisons I don't like as well for a number of other reasons. I can manipulate this and keep seeing what the outcomes provide as I deselect or reselect comparisons. If at any point along the way after manipulating my comparisons, I'm happy with the photometry data, I can go ahead and click Save Results. Now, when I click Save Results, it will pop up and tell me that it's saved the data to a specific photometry folder, in this case, Photometry 2. Now, that's great if I want to continue working with these particular comparison stars. But what if I want to work with different comparison stars as a result? Well, that's easy as well. I can just click Return to Photometry. This will bring me back to my photometry menu, and I can go through and either remove certain comparisons, add to the comparisons, or modify the comparisons that I'm using. Now that I've made some changes to the stars I was using as comparisons, I'm going to go ahead and say Run Photometry again. Now, as this is proceeding, I'm noticing on the left that the stars are growing beyond the apertures that I've provided. You don't need to wait for completion. You can simply click Stop Photometry so that you don't have to wait for this entire process to complete. This will return me back to my photometry menu, and I can increase my apertures. Now I'll go ahead and run photometry again and see what I get. Now, every time I run photometry, it'll save it to another folder. Anytime I make changes to the active comparisons and save results, it will save it to another folder. I'm going to do this multiple times, trying to find the best comparisons possible. Now, once you're happy with all of your results, you can click Proceed to Fitting menu. Here we are in the Fitting menu, and you can see in the upper right-hand corner, all of my results are displayed. So I can see that I've actually got photometry, photometry 2, photometry 3, and so forth. I've also been provided aperture and Gauss-based results for each photometric set of data. Now I can select one from the list and view the output on screen, including the associated light curve. Now remember, this data on screen has already been quadratically detrended, meaning we've used the comparison stars in a relationship with the target star to help normalize our findings. When looking at the graphs, the red line is a best fit model based on your actual data, while the cyan line is the expected model based on the parameters on the right. Now, the parameters on the right were obtained by the system earlier on in the process when we identified our target. If you have different information you need to provide, you can manually do that at this time. So now I can just step through my models and see which set of comparison stars actually worked best. My best data actually came from Photometry 3. You can see that on the left and right of Photometry 3's data set that my ingress and egress were pretty close for the transit, and that my light curve depth is also very close to what was expected. So once we're happy with the data set, we can then go on to the advanced fitting properties in the bottom right. Here you'll see your scatter limit. The scatter limit controls how your data's outliers are fitted. The lower the value, the more data is excluded. Typically, based on what I've been reading, 3 is typically used. However, moving above 3 is okay, although you might not see so much of a difference unless your data has a lot of outliers. Take one more glance to verify your transit model on screen, specifically the depth as well as the ingress and egress. And when you're ready, go ahead and click Run Fitting. Now this is going to fit your data using an MCMC approach. It's a type of Bayesian model. I wouldn't worry about it too much unless you want to read the research papers. Now, as a result of this, if you find that your light curve ends up being a little bit too noisy based on your data, one of the things you can do to fit this a little bit better with MCMC is on the previous form, you can increase the number of iterations. As a matter of fact, the product used to default to 150,000 iterations. It now actually defaults to 100,000. So if you're having an issue, you may try to bump that up to 150,000 and see if that helps. I have yet to make a change to either of those numbers on the previous form. And you can see now that because we've performed this MCMC fitting within our Photometry 3 dataset, it has saved this dataset within the Photometry 3 folder. So now that we're done, we can see that if we go back to the main HOPS page, it has told us that we've completed each step along the way, and the only thing we have left to do is exit. We can now view the data in our file system, and you can see I have all of my photometric data. I'll go into Photometry 3, I can go into Photometry Aperture Fitting, and I can see the data results. I can look at the detrended model, and this is what I could share with others, or just keep for my own records. Now, a lot of the other data in this folder is needed if you plan on sharing this back with the scientific community. There are a lot of other options in here as well, including things like the untrended model and corner plots, and a lot of other scientific things you probably don't need, including this image that shows us our target star along with the specific comparisons we used. Now, if you want the other version of the image that we saw previously when we were working on the data, the one that showed the expected model along with our data model, that does not get output. You may need to do something like a screen capture to grab a copy of that. One last thing, if you happen to exit along the way and you realized you'd like to go back in and maybe get a screen capture of that image, just go ahead and open HOPS, and then it defaults back when it reloads to the place it last left off. So we'll see here that it shows all of our steps are completed, and we can jump right back into ExoPlanet Fitting and take our screen capture. All right, well, hopefully this HOPS video tutorial helped you out. Maybe you feel a little bit more comfortable using HOPS now. It is certainly a little bit more easy than something like AstroImage-J, but I will still say that AIJ gives you a lot more flexibility in how you present your data, both during your research process going through the comparisons, as well as the output data that you can provide on the plot, because there's a lot more data available to you in AIJ. With that being said, I can see why a lot of people are using HOPS. It's certainly a little bit easier, it's a nice graphical interface, and it just works. All right, so like I told you last time, get your telescopes out, point them at the stars, and start looking for exoplanets. If you found this video useful, like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. And of course, as always, clear skies.